She could smell herself rotting from the inside out, not the polite decay that comes after death. The violent, living putrefaction of flesh that refuses to die. Elizabeth II, the most powerful woman in Europe, could taste the infection every time she swallowed. She could feel her face crumbling beneath layers of toxic white paint. And in her final days, when her ladies-in-waiting tried to approach her bed, they had to cover their mouths to keep from retching. This wasn't supposed to happen to queens. They were meant to die with dignity, surrounded by prayers and perfume. Instead, England's Virgin Queen spent her last 72 hours sitting upright on cushions, unable to lie down, unable to speak, watching her own body betray her piece by piece. The woman who had refused to show weakness for 45 years was finally horrifically vulnerable. And she was completely aware of every moment. What happened in her final 72 hours will make you question everything you know about royal medicine and the price of vanity. Because the infection that killed Elizabeth didn't start in her final days. It had been growing, festering, poisoning her for decades. Some historians believe her own advisors knew. Others suggest they deliberately let it continue. After all, a sick queen is easier to control than a healthy one. Was this nature's cruelty? Or was England's greatest monarch murdered slowly, one toxic layer of makeup at a time? Subscribe to Hollow History, because this story will force you to see the Virgin Queen as you've never seen her before, through the lens of her own decomposing reflection. But to understand how England's Virgin Queen became a living cadaver, we must go back to the moment the infection first entered her body, a moment she didn't even notice. January 1562. Elizabeth had been queen for just 3 years when she made a decision that would literally rot her alive from the inside. She was 29 years old, and by every account, breathtaking. Portraits from this period show a woman with porcelain skin, intelligent eyes, and the kind of bone structure that made ambassadors stumble over their Latin. Her red gold hair caught light like living flame, and her hands, those long, elegant hands she was so proud of, moved through the air like a dancer's. Foreign dignitaries wrote home describing her as the most beautiful monarch in Europe. She knew it, she weaponized it, and in 3 weeks, it would all be gone. The decision seemed innocent enough. A bath. Not the quick wash basin routine most Tudors practiced, but a full immersion in heated water. A luxury reserved for the wealthy and a practice many physicians warned against during winter months. Tudor medical theory held that bathing opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to corrupted air and disease. Elizabeth dismissed these concerns. She was young, healthy, invincible in the way only those who've never been truly sick can feel. What she didn't know was that somewhere in her court, perhaps a visiting diplomat, maybe a servant, possibly even one of her own ladies-in-waiting, someone was already infected. Smallpox, known then as the speckled monster, was ravaging London that winter. The disease showed no mercy to class or beauty. It entered through the breath, invisible particles carrying death and disfigurement in equal measure. The incubation period was cruel in its deception. 10 to 14 days, where you felt perfectly fine while the virus silently multiplied in your bloodstream, preparing for its violent emergence. Elizabeth took her bath on January 10th. By January 16th, she complained of a headache. Her ladies dismissed it. The Queen often suffered headaches when dealing with Parliament or marriage negotiations, and both were constant sources of stress. When the headache intensified and fever followed, her physician suggested it was merely the strain of governance. After all, running a kingdom while fending off marriage proposals from half of Europe's royalty would exhaust anyone. Elizabeth agreed. She refused to rest, refused to show weakness, and absolutely refused to see a doctor for what she considered a trivial ailment. This refusal wasn't mere stubbornness. Elizabeth lived in perpetual terror of assassination. Her sister Mary had died just 4 years earlier under mysterious circumstances, and Elizabeth knew that poison was a favored tool of royal murder. Doctors with their tinctures and tonics had convenient access to toxins. She trusted almost no one, and certainly not the physicians who had failed to save her sister. Better to suffer a headache than risk letting a potential assassin near her with remedies. But her paranoia, however justified, was about to cost her everything. By January 18th, the fever had become impossible to hide. Elizabeth's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. She complained of back pain so severe she could barely stand. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen this before, in London streets, in neighboring households, in their own families. The pattern was unmistakable. Still, no one dared speak the word aloud. To suggest the Queen had smallpox was to acknowledge that her legendary beauty might soon be destroyed. The court entered what can only be described as collective denial. Courtiers whispered in corners, placing bets on whether she would survive, whether she would be scarred, whether she would remain marriageable if she lived. But in her presence, everyone maintained the fiction that this was merely a bad cold. Elizabeth herself clung to this delusion with desperate intensity. She continued dressing in her finest gowns, continued receiving visitors, continued scratching absently at a spot on her left cheek that had begun to itch. That scratching should have been the final warning. One of her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Mary Sidney, noticed the Queen returning to that same spot on her face repeatedly throughout January 20th. First with one finger, delicate and distracted, then with two, more insistently. By evening, Elizabeth was clawing at it, hard enough to leave marks, all while insisting nothing was wrong. The face that launched 1,000 portraits was about to become unrecognizable. What happened next would determine not just Elizabeth's fate, but the entire succession of the English crown. Because smallpox alone doesn't explain what happened next. The virus typically ran its course in 3 weeks. Brutal, often disfiguring, but survivable. Elizabeth's case was different. Something about her body's response, or perhaps something about the treatments her physicians would eventually force upon her, would turn a survivable disease into a nightmare that lasted decades. On January 21st, the red spots appeared, first on her face, then spreading across her chest and arms with terrifying speed. Elizabeth finally allowed her doctors to examine her. What they found made them go pale. This wasn't the typical presentation. The pustules were forming faster than they had ever seen, clustering so densely that healthy skin became invisible between them. Within hours, her face had swollen beyond recognition. Within a day, she was delirious with fever, her body temperature so high that servants could feel the heat radiating from her skin without touching her. Within 48 hours, Elizabeth would be declared dead by her own physicians. But she wasn't dead. She was conscious, and she could hear everything they were saying about her corpse. October 16th, 1562. The Queen of England lay motionless, her pulse undetectable, her breath invisible. Her doctors declared her dead. Then her eyes opened. The medical phenomenon that trapped Elizabeth between life and death has a name now. Smallpox-induced syncope. A coma-like state where the body's vital signs become so suppressed that even trained physicians cannot detect them. The fever had spiked so catastrophically that her brain essentially shut down non-essential functions to preserve itself. Her heartbeat slowed to perhaps 10 beats per minute. far too faint for Tudor doctors to feel through her swollen, pustule-covered wrist. Her breathing became so shallow that mirrors held to her lips showed no fog. By every measure available to 16th century medicine, Elizabeth Tudor was a corpse. The panic that erupted in Hampton Court Palace was immediate and absolute. Within minutes of the death declaration, messengers were racing toward London. The Privy Council convened in emergency session. The question wasn't whether Elizabeth was dead. The physicians had confirmed it. But who would take the throne? England had no clear heir. The succession crisis that Elizabeth had spent 3 years avoiding by refusing to marry or name a successor had arrived with devastating speed. Catholics backed Mary, Queen of Scots. Protestants scrambled to find alternatives. Some councillors quietly drew up plans to flee the country before civil war erupted. But in her death chamber, something impossible happened. Elizabeth's eyes opened. Not slowly, not gradually. They snapped open with sudden, terrifying clarity. Her mouth remained closed, her body still paralyzed, but those eyes moved. They tracked the physicians backing away in horror. They followed the servants crossing themselves and whispering prayers. Recent analysis of contemporary accounts suggests something even more disturbing. Elizabeth was conscious through the entire episode. She could hear her doctors declaring her dead. She could hear the council members arguing over her corpse about who should rule next. She was trapped inside her own body, fully aware, unable to move or speak or signal that she was still alive. The trapped-in-your-body horror lasted approximately 4 hours before she could move her fingers, 6 hours before she could speak, and nearly 12 hours before she could sit up. By then, the treatments had already begun, and they were worse than the disease. Tudor medicine operated on theories that would be considered torture by modern standards. Dr. Burckhardt, the German physician finally convinced to treat the resurrected queen, employed every remedy known to 16th century medical science. First came mercury, applied both externally as an ointment and internally as a tonic, a treatment that would cause its own cascade of poisoning over the coming decades. Then bloodletting, because Tudor doctors believed infected blood needed to be drained. They opened veins in her arms, her neck, behind her ears, letting her blood pool into basins while she drifted in and out of consciousness. But the most bizarre treatment was the red cloth cure. Based on the medieval theory that colors could draw out disease, Elizabeth was wrapped completely in scarlet fabric, placed in a room where every surface, walls, ceiling, curtains, even the attendants' clothing, was dyed red. The theory held that red would draw the pox outward, preventing them from turning inward and attacking the internal organs. Whether it worked or simply coincided with the natural progression of the disease remains debated. What isn't debated is that Elizabeth spent 6 days in that crimson tomb, delirious and in agony, while the pustules on her face multiplied and merged into landscapes of infection. For 6 days, no one knew if she would live or die. The fever would break, then return. The pustules would crust over, then rupture and weep. And through it all, one woman stayed by her side. Lady Mary Sidney was 27 years old, beautiful, married to one of Elizabeth's favorite courtiers, and mother to a young son. She was also Elizabeth's closest friend, one of the few people the Queen genuinely trusted. When other ladies in waiting fled the sick room in terror of contagion, Mary volunteered to stay. She knew the cost. Everyone knew the cost. Smallpox was viciously contagious, especially in the intimate quarters of a sick room. By choosing to nurse Elizabeth, Mary Sidney was essentially choosing disfigurement. Lady Mary Sidney would pay a price that makes medieval martyrdom look merciful. Mary bathed Elizabeth's pustule-covered body. She held cups of mercury-laced water to the Queen's cracked lips. She changed the red wrappings hourly, each time confronting the spreading devastation of Elizabeth's face. She slept on a cot beside the royal bed, breathing the same infected air, touching the same contaminated linens. Contemporary accounts describe Mary singing to Elizabeth during the worst nights, gentle melodies from their childhood, meant to calm the Queen's delirium. On October 22nd, the fever finally broke. Elizabeth's temperature dropped, her mind cleared, and the pustules began their slow process of drying and scabbing. The physicians declared cautious optimism. The Privy Council breathed in relief. Succession plans were quietly burned. But the real horror was just beginning. Because smallpox's true damage reveals itself not during the infection, but after. As the pustules dry, they form thick scabs that eventually fall away, taking with them whatever tissue lay beneath. Shallow pox leave shallow scars. Deep pox, the kind that cluster and merge, can remove entire sections of skin, leaving behind pitted craters and permanent disfigurement. Elizabeth's pox had been catastrophically deep. The moment she was strong enough to sit up, Elizabeth demanded a mirror. The request sent her remaining ladies-in-waiting into visible panic. They made excuses. Mirrors had been removed for cleaning, the light was too poor, she needed to rest more. Elizabeth's voice, still weak but absolutely commanding, cut through their objections. She wanted a mirror. She wanted it now. 3 servants quit rather than be present for what came next. They simply walked out of the palace, abandoning positions that had taken years to secure, rather than witness their queen's reaction. The one who stayed, a girl named Catherine Carey, would never speak of that moment for the rest of her life. Even decades later, when pressed by historians, she would only shake her head and change the subject. But we know what Elizabeth saw. Court records and contemporary letters describe the damage in clinical detail. The smallpox had concentrated on her face with unusual severity. Her forehead, once smooth, was now a landscape of deep pits and ridges. Her cheeks bore crater-like depressions where clusters of pustules had merged and consumed the underlying tissue. Her nose had swollen and never fully returned to its original shape. Most devastating of all, the infection had concentrated around her hairline, and when the scabs fell away, they took patches of hair with them, leaving irregular bald spots along her temples and crown. The silence that followed must have been profound. Because Elizabeth's obsession with beauty wasn't vanity. It was political survival. In an age where marriage alliances shaped international relations and a queen's appearance directly influenced her diplomatic value, disfigurement was a form of political death. She was unmarried, childless, and ruling a kingdom that believed women were fundamentally unfit to govern alone. Her beauty had been her leverage, her tool for controlling ambitious suitors and maintaining power. And in 6 days, smallpox had destroyed it. When Elizabeth finally demanded a mirror, 3 servants quit rather than be present for what came next. The one who stayed would never speak of that moment for the rest of her life, but we know what Elizabeth saw. Because she never stopped trying to hide it. The smallpox had spared her life, but stolen something more valuable than breath. It had taken the only weapon a female monarch in the 16th century truly possessed: her face. The scarring was catastrophic in its specificity. Medical records and eyewitness accounts describe deep pockmarks concentrated across her forehead, each one a crater roughly the size of a pea, some deeper. Her cheeks bore what physicians called confluence scars, areas where multiple pustules had merged, creating irregular depressions that gave her face an uneven, almost melted appearance in certain lights. The bridge of her nose carried a particular cluster that had destroyed the delicate skin, leaving visible tissue damage that no amount of powder could fully conceal. Along her hairline, patches of scalp showed through where the infection had been so severe that hair follicles never recovered. But the worst damage, the scars that would haunt her for decades, were the ones around her mouth and jawline, deep pits that would eventually become entry points for something far more deadly than vanity. The psychological snap was immediate and permanent. The woman who emerged from that sick room bore the same name as the one who had entered, but courtiers immediately recognized they were dealing with a fundamentally different person. The playful charm vanished. The easy laughter stopped. The Elizabeth who had flirted with ambassadors and enjoyed witty banter became cold, calculating, and viciously defensive about her appearance. Servants learned within days never to look directly at her face. Courtiers discovered that any reference, however oblique, to beauty, complexion, or even the weather's effect on skin could trigger explosive rage. Within a week of her recovery, Elizabeth summoned her apothecaries. She wanted a solution, not a remedy. The damage was permanent, but a concealment. What she demanded and what they created would slowly kill her over the next 40 years. The Sahisos mask, as it came to be known in whispered court circles, was a concoction called Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead and vinegar. Italian nobility had been using versions of it for decades to achieve the coveted pale complexion that signified wealth and status. But Elizabeth needed more than fashion. She needed obliteration of the truth beneath. The formula her chemists developed was far more concentrated than anything used before. A thick, poisonous paste that could fill the deep scars and create an illusion of smooth, porcelain skin. The daily routine became a ritual that consumed hours. Elizabeth would rise before dawn, and 3 specially trained servants, and only these 3, sworn to secrecy about what they saw, would begin the reconstruction. First, they cleansed her face with a solution of mercury and alum, itself toxic, meant to tighten the scarred tissue. Then came egg whites, painted on to create a base layer. Only then could the ceruse be applied, and it required extraordinary skill. Too little, and the scars showed through. Too much, and it cracked and flaked, drawing more attention than the scars themselves. The servants used brushes, sponges, and sometimes their own fingers to press the white paste into every crater, every depression, every irregularity. They built up layers, sometimes 4 or 5 applications, until Elizabeth's face became a smooth, white canvas that bore almost no resemblance to the damaged skin beneath. Then came rouge for her cheeks, kohl for her eyes, and a special red paste for her lips, also lead-based, also toxic. The entire process took between 2 and 3 hours, and it happened every single morning for the rest of her life. What Elizabeth didn't know, or perhaps no one fully understood at the time, was that lead absorbs most efficiently through broken skin, and her face was a landscape of broken skin. Every scar, every pockmark, every tiny fissure was a direct pathway into her bloodstream. The lead was accumulating in her bones, her brain, her organs. Each application added to the growing toxicity. Within a year, she was experiencing the early symptoms of lead poisoning, occasional tremors in her hands, periods of confusion, sudden violent headaches. Within 5 years, the accumulation had reached dangerous levels. Within 10, it was affecting her personality, her judgment, her physical health. And she never stopped. because the alternative, being seen, was worse than slow death. The Virgin Queen identity hardened into obsession during this period, and it makes perfect psychological sense. Marriage proposals, once abundant, had slowed after her disfigurement. Ambassadors who had written home praising her beauty now wrote in coded language about her unique appearance. Elizabeth, always politically astute, understood what was happening. She was becoming unmarriageable, not by choice, but by circumstance. So she transformed necessity into strategy, declaring herself married to England, wedded to her people, the Virgin Queen who needed no earthly husband. But beneath the rhetoric was the simple truth. She couldn't bear for anyone to see her unmasked. A husband would see her face without the ceruse. Children would mean pregnancy, when maintaining the elaborate makeup routine would be impossible. Physical intimacy would reveal the truth. The Virgin Queen persona wasn't just political genius, it was trauma response, a grand rationalization for the intimacy she could no longer risk. Her control over her own image became totalitarian. In 1563, Elizabeth issued a proclamation banning any portraits painted from life unless she personally approved the artist. Only a handful of painters ever received this approval, and they were given strict templates to follow. The portraits show a young, smooth-faced Elizabeth in her 20s, an image she maintained in official paintings even into her 60s. Any artist who dared depict her realistically found their work seized and burned. Some found themselves imprisoned for defaming the monarch. The victims of her vanity multiplied. A French ambassador who mentioned in a letter that the Queen's complexion appeared uneven was declared persona non grata and expelled within 24 hours. A courtier who praised another woman's smooth skin in Elizabeth's presence was banished from court for 6 months. A portrait painter who included too much detail in his rendering of her face was never heard from again. Contemporary records suggest he may have been quietly executed, though the official story claimed he'd fled to France. Her cruelty toward other scarred women revealed the depth of her psychological damage. When Lady Mary Sidney finally recovered from the smallpox she'd contracted while nursing Elizabeth, she returned to court expecting gratitude and welcome. Instead, she found a queen who could barely look at her. Mary's scarring was severe, comparable to Elizabeth's own, and seeing it was like confronting a mirror Elizabeth couldn't control. Within weeks, Mary was quietly dismissed from her position. Her husband, Henry Sidney, abandoned her, repulsed by her disfigurement. She spent the rest of her life in isolated retirement, her beauty destroyed, her marriage ruined, her sacrifice rewarded with exile. Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged Mary's service again. The woman who had risked everything, who had sacrificed her own face to save the Queen's life, was erased from the royal narrative. Because Mary's scars were a reminder of Elizabeth's scars, and reminders were intolerable. Some historians believe her advisors knew about the lead poisoning and let it continue. A healthy, long-lived Elizabeth meant stability, but a subtly impaired Elizabeth, one whose judgment was occasionally clouded, whose physical health kept her from being too vigorous in her rule, might be easier to guide. The Privy Council certainly noticed the tremors that began in her 30s, the memory lapses that became more frequent in her 40s, the unexplained rages that would seize her without warning. Yet no one suggested she stop using the ceruse. No physician recommended alternatives. The poison that was slowly destroying her mind and body continued, uninterrupted, for 4 decades. The lead was accumulating in her bones, her brain, her organs. Modern forensic analysis of her few remaining possessions, a pair of gloves, strands of hair, show lead concentrations that would be considered acutely toxic by today's standards. She was, quite literally, poisoning herself to maintain an illusion. Every morning, she chose slow death over visible truth. Her rejection of marriage proposals now carries tragic weight. It wasn't just political calculation or fear of losing power. It was the desperate act of a woman who couldn't risk being seen. Her rage at mirror makers who showed truth wasn't vanity. It was self-protection against a reality too painful to confront. The evolution from victim to villain was complete. The disease had made her a victim. Her response made her a monster. For 40 years, Elizabeth painted poison onto her ravaged face every single morning. By 1603, the lead had accumulated to lethal levels. But the lead wasn't killing her fastest. Something else was. Something that had been growing in the crater where her tooth used to be. February 1603. The most powerful woman in Europe couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't stop the infection that was literally dissolving her jaw from the inside. The tooth in question was an upper left molar. The second from the back, positioned exactly where her heaviest smallpox scarring had left a particularly deep crater in her gum line. No one knows exactly when the decay started, but court records suggest Elizabeth first complained of tooth pain around 1598, 5 years before her death. She was 65 years old, and she had spent 4 decades painting lead poison onto her face every morning. That lead had seeped into everything: her bloodstream, her bones, and critically, her teeth. Lead poisoning weakens enamel. It makes teeth brittle, prone to fracture, susceptible to infection. Elizabeth's teeth, after 40 years of lead exposure, were compromised at a cellular level. What should have been a minor cavity in that upper molar became something catastrophic because the tooth itself had been slowly dying for decades. But she refused extraction. Absolutely refused. To understand why requires understanding Tudor dentistry, a practice that makes medieval torture look refined. There was no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, no concept of infection control. Tooth extraction in 1603 meant being held down by multiple strong men while a barber surgeon, not even a physician, but a barber who also did surgery, inserted iron pincers into your mouth and pulled. If the tooth didn't come out whole, which often it didn't, they would dig into your gums with sharp hooks to extract the fragments. The pain was so severe that people frequently passed out. Many died from the shock. Others died days later from infections that spread from the open wound. Elizabeth had witnessed tooth extractions. She'd heard the screams that carried through palace corridors. She'd seen courtiers return with swollen, bleeding mouths, unable to speak for weeks. She'd watched infections set in, the fever, the delirium, the death. Her terror of the procedure wasn't irrational vanity. It was based on brutal reality. But there was another factor, one that reveals the cruel irony of her situation. Elizabeth was addicted to sugar. The 16th century saw sugar transform from rare medicinal substance to status symbol. As England's colonial ventures expanded, sugar became increasingly available and extraordinarily expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it, and Elizabeth had unlimited access. She developed what contemporary accounts describe as a notorious sweet tooth. She consumed candied fruits, sugar-coated nuts, marzipan, honey cakes, and conserves with every meal. Foreign dignitaries learned quickly that the surest path to her favor was a gift of exotic sugared delicacies. Her teeth, already compromised by lead poisoning, didn't stand a chance. By her 50s, several were visibly blackened. By her 60s, she was missing multiple teeth, the gaps carefully hidden behind her closed-mouth smile in official portraits. Court observers noted that she often held a scented cloth to her mouth when speaking, ostensibly to ward off bad air, actually to hide her dental decay. The sugar that rotted her teeth was literally a political gift. Every Portuguese diplomat bearing candied citrus, every Spanish ambassador presenting sugar sculptures, every colonial merchant offering exotic preserves. They were all, unknowingly, contributing to the infection that would kill her. The abscess began forming sometime in late 1602. An abscess is a pocket of infection, pus trapped beneath tissue with nowhere to drain. When it forms at a tooth root, especially a tooth already weakened by lead poisoning and sugar decay, it burrows deep. Imagine a slow-motion explosion occurring inside your jaw, bacteria multiplying exponentially, creating pressure that builds and builds. The pain would have been extraordinary. A throbbing, relentless agony that radiated from her jaw into her temple, her ear, down her neck. Elizabeth, who had endured smallpox, who had painted poison on her face for 40 years, tried to endure this too. She increased her pain remedies, opium-laced wine, which dulled the agony but also clouded her judgment. She avoided solid foods, subsisting on broths and jellies that she could swallow without chewing. She retreated from public appearances, claiming fatigue, age, the weather. But she couldn't hide the smell. Dental abscesses produce a distinctive odor, the sweet rot smell of necrotic tissue, bacterial waste, and putrefaction. It's not subtle. By January 1603, courtiers were noticing it. They would approach the queen for audiences and involuntarily step back, their faces betraying their revulsion before they could control their expressions. Servants tasked with helping her dress reported the smell was strongest in the morning, before she'd rinsed her mouth with the rosewater and herb concoctions she used to mask it. No one dared tell her. How do you inform the Queen of England that she smells like death? Several of her closest advisors discussed it among themselves, debating whether to suggest she see a tooth drawer. None found the courage. The woman who had executed courtiers for lesser offenses, who had raged at servants for bringing imperfect mirrors, who had banished her best friend for having similar scars. This woman was not someone you told about personal failing. So the infection spread. Dental abscesses don't stay contained. The bacteria multiply, the pressure builds, and eventually the infection finds a pathway. Through the bone, into the sinuses, along tissue planes toward the brain. By February, Elizabeth was experiencing the early symptoms of septicemia, blood infection. The fever became constant, spiking in the evenings. Her thinking grew confused. She would start conversations and forget them mid-sentence. She accused servants of stealing items that were sitting in plain sight. The paranoia, always present since her sister's death, intensified to clinical levels. She believed her food was poisoned and refused meals. She thought her ladies-in-waiting were plotting against her and dismissed several from service. She became convinced that her counselors were communicating with her enemies and would fly into rages during meetings, accusing loyal advisors of treason based on imagined slights. The lead poisoning and the septicemia were creating a synergistic nightmare. Lead affects cognitive function, causing confusion, memory loss, personality changes. Sepsis causes delirium, fever, altered mental state. Together, they were literally dissolving her mind, while the infection dissolved her jaw. Modern medical analysis suggests the combined effect accelerated her decline catastrophically. Each condition made the other worse. The lead-weakened immune system couldn't fight the infection effectively, while the infection's fever increased her body's absorption of the lead still being applied daily to her face. Because even now, even as she was dying, she still applied the mask. Every single morning, despite the tremors that made her hands shake so badly she needed assistance. Despite the confusion that sometimes left her staring at her reflection without recognition, despite the fact that the infection in her jaw was causing her face to swell asymmetrically. She still demanded the ceruse. Her final vanity was literally crumbling. The lead paste, applied over skin stretched tight by infection-induced swelling, would crack and flake throughout the day. Servants noticed white powder falling from her face like snow. The abscess was causing tissue breakdown along her jaw, and the ceruse couldn't adhere properly to the deteriorating skin. She was trying to maintain an illusion on a canvas that was actively decomposing. By late February, Elizabeth could no longer eat in public. The pain of chewing was unbearable. But more than that, she couldn't risk anyone seeing the difficulty she had swallowing, the way her jaw wouldn't close properly because of the swelling, the way food would sometimes fall from her mouth because she'd lost sensation on that side of her face. The death of her teeth meant the death of her dignity. She began refusing her presence chamber appearances. She stopped attending Privy Council meetings. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting for longer and longer periods, sitting alone in her private chambers with only her own reflection for company. And even that reflection was becoming intolerable. The mirror showed what the mask could no longer hide. When physicians finally demanded to examine her in early March, she refused. She wouldn't open her mouth. She wouldn't allow anyone to see inside, to witness the rot, to confirm what everyone already knew. One doctor later wrote that he could smell the putrefaction from across the room, a stench so foul that it overpowered even the strongest perfumes Her Majesty employed to conceal it. The infection reached her brain approximately 11 days before her death. Modern diagnosis is clear. Septicemia from a dental abscess, complicated by chronic lead poisoning. The infection spread from the tooth root, through her jawbone, up through her sinuses, and eventually reached the meninges, the protective membranes around her brain and spinal cord. Once it reached that point, her death became inevitable. One tooth extraction could have saved her. One moment of surrender to physical vulnerability, one acknowledgement that her body needed help, one compromise of pride for survival, and she might have lived years longer. But she preferred death to admitting physical weakness. She chose slow rot over the humiliation of being held down, of screaming, of showing fear, of being less than the image she'd maintained for 40 years. She had 47 days left to live. On March 19, 1603, Elizabeth's ladies found her collapsed on the floor of her chamber, conscious but unable to stand. She would never stand again. And in her final 5 days, the mask would finally, literally, fall off. March 19th to 24, 1603. England's greatest queen spent her final 5 days sitting upright on cushions, unable to lie down because the infection in her throat would suffocate her. And through it all, she remained conscious, aware of every moment of her body's betrayal. They found her at dawn, collapsed beside her bed, but still conscious. Her ladies-in-waiting later testified that Elizabeth's eyes were open, tracking their movements, but she made no sound. When they tried to lift her back into bed, she resisted with surprising strength for a woman who could no longer stand. She gestured, weakly, frantically, toward the cushions piled in the corner of her chamber. It took them nearly an hour to understand what she wanted. She refused to lie down. The infection that had spread from her tooth through her jaw had now reached her throat, causing massive swelling. If she reclined, the swelling would close her airway completely. She would drown in her own infected tissue. So she sat, propped against cushions arranged on the floor, her spine rigid, her head held at an angle that kept her throat open enough to breathe. The position was agony. Imagine sitting upright for 5 days straight, unable to recline, unable to sleep properly, every muscle screaming for release. But the alternative was suffocation. And Elizabeth, even now, chose prolonged suffering over quick death. Her physicians begged to examine her. She turned her face away, pressing her lips together so tightly that they turned white beneath the cracking ceruse. She wouldn't open her mouth. She wouldn't let them see inside. Even on the floor, unable to stand, dying from an infection everyone could smell, she clung to the illusion that if she didn't acknowledge the rot, it wasn't real. The silence was absolute. Elizabeth, known for her sharp wit and clever speeches, didn't speak a single word that entire first day. Servants whispered that the infection had taken her voice. But those closest to her knew the truth. She could still speak. She was choosing not to. Because speaking meant opening her mouth, and opening her mouth risked revealing the horror inside. The blackened, fractured tooth, the swollen, oozing gums, the tissue that was literally dying while she lived. The fever spiked near midnight. Elizabeth's temperature rose so high that servants could feel the heat radiating from her body without touching her. The sepsis was reaching its final stages, bacteria flooding her bloodstream, her immune system, already compromised by decades of lead poisoning, collapsing completely. That's when she began speaking to ghosts. "Mary," she whispered, her voice thick and strange, distorted by the swelling in her throat. "Mary, forgive me." Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged terrified glances. There were two Marys in Elizabeth's past. Her sister, Mary Nessard, whose death had brought Elizabeth to the throne, and Lady Mary Sidney, the friend who had sacrificed her beauty to nurse Elizabeth through smallpox and been rewarded with exile. "I see your face," Elizabeth continued, her eyes fixed on empty air. "I see all the faces. Robert, Anne, Catherine, they're waiting." Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and rumored lover, had died in 1588. Anne Boleyn, her mother, executed when Elizabeth was 2 years old. Catherine Howard, her cousin, beheaded by Elizabeth's own father. The dead were crowding her dying mind, and she was naming them one by one. A priest was summoned, but Elizabeth waved him away with a trembling hand. Even delirious, even hallucinating, she maintained enough clarity to refuse last rites. She would not confess. She would not admit weakness, not even to God. The woman who had spent 40 years maintaining an illusion couldn't surrender it now, not even for salvation. The ghost conversations continued through the night. Sometimes she argued with invisible accusers, sometimes she pleaded. Once she laughed, a horrible, wet sound that made her attendants step back in horror. The lead poisoning had been affecting her brain for decades, causing memory loss and personality changes. Now, combined with sepsis-induced delirium, her mind was fragmenting completely. By the third day, the stench had become unbearable. Multiple servants later described it as the putrefaction of living flesh, the sweet rot smell of necrotic tissue, bacterial waste, and decay. It wasn't the smell of a corpse, which develops after death. This was worse. This was the smell of someone rotting while still alive. The infection in her jaw had created areas of tissue necrosis, living tissue that was dying and decomposing while still attached to her body. The abscess had ruptured internally, draining into her throat, and the bacteria were consuming everything they touched. Modern medical analysis suggests she was experiencing necrotizing fasciitis of the oral cavity. Flesh-eating disease, essentially, spreading from her tooth root through the soft tissues of her face and neck. Servants began refusing assignments to her chamber. Those who did enter tied perfume-soaked cloths around their faces, but it didn't help. The smell penetrated everything. One lady-in-waiting vomited into her hands and fled. Another fainted and had to be carried out. A third quit her position entirely, abandoning years of service rather than spend another hour in that room. Elizabeth noticed. Even through the fever and delirium, she saw their revulsion. She saw them turning their faces away, saw them breathing through their mouths, saw the horror in their eyes. And she understood what it meant. The final breakdown of the illusion. They could see past the mask now. They could smell the truth. She tried to speak that afternoon, managed only a few words before the pain stopped her. "I am not," she gasped, each word clearly agony. "Dying." But she was, and everyone knew it. The morning routine happened for the last time. 3 servants, the only ones who had seen her real face for 40 years, approached with the bowl of Venetian ceruse. Elizabeth's hands shook so badly from the combined effects of lead poisoning and sepsis that she couldn't hold the mirror. They had to hold it for her. What she saw must have been devastating. The infection had caused severe facial swelling, especially along the left side where the tooth abscess had originated. The skin was stretched tight, shiny, and in some areas had taken on a grayish tinge, the color of tissue on the verge of death. Previous applications of ceruse had dried and cracked, creating a crazy quilt pattern across her face. And in several spots along her jawline, the skin had actually broken down, weeping clear fluid mixed with pus. They tried anyway. They mixed the lead paste, the poisonous white powder that had been slowly killing her for 4 decades. They attempted to apply it to her face, as they had every morning for 40 years. It wouldn't adhere. The skin was too damaged, too swollen, too wet, with the fluid seeping from infected tissue. The ceruse slid off in chunks, mixing with the discharge from her decomposing jaw. They tried again, and again, building up layer after layer, but each layer simply sloughed off, unable to grip the dying tissue beneath. Elizabeth watched in the mirror as the illusion died before her eyes. The mask that had protected her, defined her, imprisoned her for 4 decades. It was literally sliding off her decomposing face. And there was nothing she could do. The vanity that had sustained her through smallpox, through political crisis, through 40 years of lonely rule, was finally, physically, impossible to maintain. She began to weep. Tears cut tracks through the failing makeup, revealing the ravaged skin beneath. Her ladies-in-waiting, seeing their queen cry for perhaps the first time in their lives, didn't know whether to comfort her or look away. They chose looking away. It seemed kinder. By the 5th day, Elizabeth could no longer speak at all. The infection had caused such severe swelling in her throat that her airway was nearly closed. She breathed in shallow, labored gasps, each breath a visible struggle. The sound filled her chamber, a wet, rattling wheeze that her attendants would remember for the rest of their lives. Her counselors gathered, pressing for a decision about succession. She had refused for 40 years to name an heir, terrified that naming a successor would make her vulnerable to plots and assassination. Now, at the end, they needed an answer. England needed an answer. She couldn't speak, so she gestured. Different accounts claim different things. Some say she pointed upward, indicating heaven. Others say she made a crown shape with her trembling hands, indicating James VI of Scotland. Still others claim she made no coherent gesture at all, that her counselors simply interpreted random movements the way they wanted. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. She couldn't communicate. The infection, the lead poisoning, the delirium. They had stolen her voice, her clarity, her ability to control even this final, critical decision. The woman who had commanded England for 45 years couldn't make herself understood in her last hours. Around midnight, the convulsions began. The lead poisoning, reaching toxic levels in her dying body, caused violent tremors that shook her entire frame. Her hands clenched involuntarily. Her jaw locked. Her eyes rolled back. The servants, terrified, called for physicians, but there was nothing to be done. Her body was shutting down, system by system. At 2:47 a.m. on March 24, 1603, between one labored breath and the next, Elizabeth Tudor stopped breathing. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words, no peaceful acceptance. She simply stopped, her body finally surrendering to the infections and poisons it had been fighting for days, for years, for decades. The silence that followed was profound. For 72 hours, her chamber had been filled with her labored breathing, her occasional delirious mumbling, the sounds of her suffering. Now, nothing. One of her ladies-in-waiting reached out with trembling fingers to check for a pulse, then pulled back, gagging. The smell had intensified the moment death occurred, the final barrier of living tissue giving way to complete putrefaction. The rush to remove the body was unprecedented. Normally, a monarch's corpse would lie in state for viewing, for ceremony, for the elaborate rituals of royal death. But the stench made that impossible. Within 2 hours of her death, Elizabeth's body was being prepared for a sealed coffin. The servants tasked with this duty later reported details that the official records omitted. The skin along her jaw, where the infection had been worst, had begun to liquefy. The flesh was literally sliding off the bone. One maid, attempting to close Elizabeth's jaw for a more dignified appearance, found the bone so soft from infection that it flexed under her fingers. She fainted and never returned to court. They wrapped the body quickly in layers of cerecloth soaked in preservatives. Even so, the smell penetrated. The coffin was sealed with wax and lead within 6 hours of death, extraordinarily fast for a royal funeral. The official explanation was preservation of the royal dignity. The reality was simpler. They couldn't stand to be in the same room with the corpse. Traditionally, monarchs received post-mortem examinations. Physicians would open the body, examine the organs, and determine the cause of death for the official record. Elizabeth's body was never autopsied. The official reason given was respect for Her Majesty's known aversion to physical examination. The real reason was darker. They didn't want to see what was inside. Opening her body would have revealed the full extent of the lead poisoning, the bones saturated with toxic metal, the organs damaged beyond recognition, the brain tissue likely showing visible degeneration. It would have revealed the massive infection that had spread from a single tooth through her entire jaw, into her sinuses, possibly reaching her brain. It would have documented, officially and undeniably, that England's greatest queen had died from vanity and pride. So they didn't look. They sealed the coffin, held a magnificent funeral, and let the myth survive. The official cause of death, recorded for history, was simply natural causes attendant upon old age. No mention of the tooth, no mention of the lead, no mention of the 5 days she spent rotting alive on cushions because she was too proud to lie down and die with dignity. The story told to the public bore little resemblance to what servants had witnessed. Official accounts described a peaceful death, the queen declining gracefully, sleeping away in her bed surrounded by prayers and candlelight. They spoke of her clarity until the end, her final blessing upon her people, her serene acceptance of God's will. The servants knew better. They had seen the delirium, the ghost conversations, the failed makeup. the facial tissue literally decomposing while she lived. They had smelled the putrefaction. They had heard the labored breathing, the wet death rattle, the silence. But they kept quiet. Speaking the truth about a monarch's death was treason. So the lie became history, and history buried the horror. One lady in waiting, decades later, broke her silence in a private letter that survived. They speak of Her Majesty's peaceful passing, but I was there. I saw. I smelled. There was nothing peaceful about it. She rotted alive, and she knew it, and she could not stop it. May God have mercy on her soul, for her body knew none. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. Elizabeth spent 40 years creating the image of the ageless queen, the immortal virgin, the unchanging symbol of England's power. She controlled every portrait, banned every honest depiction, and maintained an illusion so complete that foreign visitors reported seeing a woman decades younger than her actual age. And she died at 69, rotting from the inside out, her face literally falling apart while she was still conscious. The conspiracy question haunts historians. Did her advisors deliberately keep her sick? A healthy, long-lived Elizabeth meant stability, but also meant a strong-willed monarch who might make decisions they couldn't control. A subtly impaired Elizabeth. Her judgment clouded by lead poisoning, her health declining just enough to limit her vigor, might be easier to guide. The Privy Council certainly noticed the tremors, the memory lapses, the personality changes. Yet no one suggested she stop using the ceruse. No physician recommended alternatives. For 40 years, the poison continued, and those closest to her said nothing. Whether conspiracy or negligence, the result was the same. England's greatest queen poisoned herself, and everyone let it happen. The modern parallel is impossible to ignore. We live in an age of toxic beauty standards, but Elizabeth's case makes the metaphor literal. The cosmetics that promised beauty delivered death. The mask that protected her image imprisoned her in a cycle of poisoning that she couldn't escape. And the society that demanded female perfection created the conditions where a woman would choose slow death over visible imperfection. The medical lesson is brutally simple. Pride kills. One tooth extraction could have saved her life. One moment of surrender to physical vulnerability, one acknowledgement that her body needed help, one compromise of vanity for survival. But she refused. She sat on cushions for 5 days, suffocating slowly, her face decomposing while she lived, because admitting weakness was worse than death. The psychological truth cuts deeper. The infection didn't turn her into a living corpse. The crown did that years earlier. The disease just made it visible. Elizabeth had been dying by inches since 1562, since the moment smallpox stole her beauty, and she decided death was preferable to being seen. The tooth infection was just the final act of a tragedy that had been playing out for 4 decades. We have no photographs of Elizabeth's real face. No honest portraits survived her purge. But we have her death mask, a plaster cast made of her face shortly after death, before the decay became too advanced. It shows the pockmarks, the asymmetry, the damage she spent 40 years hiding. Next to her propaganda portraits, the smooth-skinned, eternally young Elizabeth, the death mask tells the truth. This is what she was hiding. This is what killed her. The haunting question remains: how many days was she aware she was rotting alive? From the moment the tooth began to hurt, she must have known something was wrong. When the abscess formed, when the infection spread, when the smell began, when her face started decomposing, at what point did she realize this was death, and she had chosen it? Did she regret it in those final hours, sitting upright on cushions, unable to speak, watching her illusion literally slide off her dying face? Or did she die believing she had won, that she had maintained the image until the very end? That history would remember the mask instead of the woman? We'll never know. But we know this. Elizabeth I, who ruled England for 45 years, who defeated the Spanish Armada, who presided over a golden age of literature and exploration, died because she refused to let anyone see a rotten tooth. Power, vanity, and death collided in one person. And the result was a queen who spent 5 days rotting alive while remaining fully conscious. Subscribe to Hollow History for more stories where power, vanity, and death collide. Because sometimes, the most horrifying monsters in history wore crowns and makeup that was slowly killing them.